In this video, we're going to take a look at the rules of probability and see how they apply to genetics and the inheritance of various characteristics. So if we're looking at something like flipping a coin, which hopefully everybody is familiar with out there, what we want to look at here is what's the probability that when you flip the coin it lands on heads. And if you think about this process here, we've really got two choices. It either lands on heads or tails. There is a possibility it could land on its side, but we're not going to pay attention to that for our purposes here. So when you look at this, the probability that you flip a coin and it lands on heads is 50% of the time you would expect it to land on heads, or 1 out of every 2. You take that coin and you flip it a second time. Well, what's the probability that it lands on heads both of these times? And when we're looking at this kind of probability of events occurring, we have our first flip, it occurs 50% of the time. The second flip, it occurs 50% of the time. So for each event here, we're looking at it being 1 out of every 2. And if we take a look at this chances of the coin flipping and landing on heads twice, what we're looking at is something called a compound event. And the probability of a compound event occurring is the product of the separate probabilities for each independent event occurring. So the probability of getting heads on our first flip, and then the probability of heads on our second flip. And if we look at that again, it's 50% of the time for each of those separate probabilities there. So we take 50%, multiply it by 50%, and we get 25% of the time we would expect to flip a coin and have it land on heads twice. We can also use our fractions there with the 1/2, and 1/2 times 1/2 gives us 1/4. So 1 out of every 4 times we would expect to get 2 heads. When we take a look at this probability of a compound event occurring, there is a 25% chance that it lands on heads both times. And if you tried it, there is a chance that it might land on tails both times. And if you think about that, that is another compound event. So the probability of that occurring is going to be 1/2 times 1/2, or 25% of the time that you would get tails when you flip that coin twice. So when we look at this, how can we find some sort of way to illustrate this process? And this is where something called the Punnett square comes into play. And this is going to show us the probability of that compound event occurring. So we take our scenario here with the flip of a coin. It has 1/2 chance of occurring on the first flip. And then we do a second flip over here. And we can take the probability for each flip here, heads or tails, and put them on either side of this Punnett square that we see right there. And so here's what it would look like there. On the first flip, half of the time you would expect it to be heads, half of the time tails. For the second flip, the same idea. Half of the time heads and half of the time tails. So we put those probabilities in each of these boxes here. Half of the time for that, half of the time for that. So there is that 1 in 4 chance, or 25% of the time. And each box that we see here is going to represent a possible scenario, and all possible scenarios are illustrated in our Punnett square right here. And the probability of each outcome occurring is illustrated in each of these boxes here. There is a 1 in 4 chance of getting heads on both flips, a 1 in 4 chance of getting a heads and then a tails, and likewise tails and heads is also 25%, and then 2 tails is 25%. So this process of using the Punnett square really shows us with a nice little depiction of how we come up with these rules of probability for the compound event there. And this leads to the question, well, what does this have to do with genetics and the inheritance of these traits between one generation cells and the next? Well, if you remember, diploid organisms have homologous chromosomes. They have 2 chromosomes, and the probability of inheriting a gene on either chromosome is 50%, or 1 out of 2. You can think of getting chromosome as like flipping a coin. You either get the heads or the tails for that. And so we can look at an example. What is the probability of having a boy or a girl? And if we take a look at this process, remember, we are diploid, so we've got 2 chromosomes. And in this case, the chromosomes that determine gender are the X and the Y chromosome. If you're a male, you have an X and a Y chromosome. If you're a female, you have these two X chromosomes. So let's take a look in this process and use our Punnett square to illustrate what's the probability of having a boy or a girl. And if we take a look at this, remember, in the process of meiosis that produces our haploid gametes, those individual chromosomes will be segregated or separated from each other and end up in the egg cells. So if we look at this one, this X chromosome on the left went over to this left egg, and this X chromosome on the right went over to this right egg. So there you can see there is something that is very similar to what we had with our coin flip, your heads or your tail situation. And the same thing is going to occur over here in the male, only there, instead of making eggs, you're going to be making the sperm with the X and the Y chromosomes there. So we drop in our Punnett square so we can illustrate this whole process here. And what are the chances of the X's or the X and the Y's coming down? Well, if you look at that, there's a 1 in 2 chance for that first one. So there is our 1 in 4 chance overall of getting an X and a Y chromosome from the egg and the sperm there. And likewise, in this case over here, we have our X and our Y chromosome, 1 in 2 chance for each event occurring, and you multiply those two together to give you that 1 in 4 chance right there. So if we sum up all of this, what we really have is there's a 50% chance that you're going to have a boy, and there's a 50% chance that you're going to have a girl. What are the chances if we do this again and have a second child? It's going to be exactly the same, because you're looking at independent events that are occurring here. The creation of these gametes is independent of what happened with the previous gamete. So if you have 5 boys in a row, the chances are still 50% that you're going to have a boy and 50% that you're going to have a girl. Hopefully this helps you and illustrates this process of how these probabilities come into play when we're looking at genetics.